Hi, so today we're going to talk about Chapter 3 from the book Deaf Culture. We'll be focusing on ASL as a language. We've already discussed the history and how ASL came to be here in America and how deaf children were educated. The first half of the chapter we're going to go through quickly, and then the second half of the chapter we'll discuss at a more leisurely pace and expand upon further. Here we go, first slide. You might be shocked in seeing this woman standing here with the middle finger, but that's the idea. That's what I'm hoping for. Hopefully this gets you thinking and ready to go for this lecture. So the reason I put this is because I want to impress upon you the idea that sign language is universal is false. So ASL is used in the US and Canada mostly, while other countries have their own sign languages. And just because a country speaks English doesn't mean that they're going to be using ASL. You know, ASL is actually more similar to French Sign Language. If you think about like England and Australia, they both speak English, but they have different sign languages. So sometimes you might be able to see and understand a little bit from another sign language from a different country. You might be able to figure it out. But some are completely different and difficult to understand. For example, Japanese Sign Language. Comparing that to ASL, Japanese Sign Language, they're just completely different languages. For instance, this middle finger. Here in America, deaf people use the middle finger as a swear word, just like you might. In Japan, this refers to a brother, the middle finger does. Anything above the eye level is an older brother, and anything below the eye level is a younger brother. It's pretty interesting, isn't it? So what I really want you to remember is that as you're learning ASL, you're not going to be able to communicate fully with deaf people during your travels. Sometimes you might be lucky enough to understand a little bit, be able to gesture back and forth, but sometimes it's just going to be completely impossible to communicate with other deaf people as you travel around the world. So ASL's history is actually pretty new. It's only about 300 years old, and when you compare that to most spoken world languages that are ancient, ASL really has a young history. It's really a baby of a language. That's one of many reasons why there are people around the world that are a bit skeptical of ASL as a language, because it's so new. You know, French isn't the only story that is part of ASL. Included are all these different parts of ASL, including Spain, which we use their finger spelling, and France, which of course has highly influenced ASL in grammar and structure. Also native sign language. Plus gestures and body language. We've incorporated that into ASL. And New England, which we talked about, Martha's Vineyard. We'll expand on it further as well. But Martha's Vineyard was also a large part of ASL. So is home sign, and we'll discuss that further soon too. So when we discuss ASL, people tend to highly focus on two characters, Gallaudet and Lauren Clare, and that's the whole story of ASL in America, but actually the story of ASL began before that. A lot of it started in France and Spain. France was really important. There was a person there named Abbe de la Paix, and this is their sign name. He set up a French residential school for the deaf. And that's where Lauren Clare went to learn sign language. And if it weren't for that establishment, Gallaudet would never have met anyone who could go with to America to set up the first deaf residential school. So that French residential school was of utmost importance in ASL history. I'm sure many of you are already sick of hearing about Gallaudet and Lauren Clare's story, But, Gallaudet met Laurent Clerc, convinced him and swayed him to move to America. Laurent Clerc agreed and set up a deaf residential school, or a school for the deaf, here in America, and ASL took off from there. So before and during Gallaudet and Laurent Clerc's time of setting up the first deaf residential school, Martha's Vineyard, the small island off the east coast of America, existed. It was very small, but it was highly populated with deaf people. The reason for that is because of the generational deafness. It's important to remember that just because two deaf parents have a child doesn't mean that the baby will be deaf. And likewise, two hearing parents could easily have a deaf child. Perhaps it's generational from the past in their lineage and it skipped generations, or whatever the case is. But there was a strong relevance to genetic deafness on Martha's Vineyard. So deaf people and hearing people in Martha's Vineyard were highly involved with each other and highly socialized amongst each other. They weren't separated. The hearing people there easily went ahead and learned sign language, and that was the way of communication with deaf people and involving deaf people in their communities. So if you're curious to know more about that, about Martha's Vineyard, unfortunately, the book we're reading doesn't touch on it much, but if you're actually interested in knowing more, I highly recommend this book. It's Everyone Here Spoke Sign Language. This is a really good resource that explains what life was like there at that time when deaf people were a large population. So when American School for the Deaf was established, the younger generations moved over from Martha's Vineyard and ended up going to ASD instead. Oftentimes when discussing ASL and ASL history, Native people are either minimized or forgotten. Their sign language, their communication systems, their gestures, and body language are sometimes minimized. But it's so important. Now, thanks to research, we highly suspect that Native culture and sign language is highly influential upon ASL today. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of documentation of their signs, of their gestures, and the way that they communicated. The reason for that is because tribes began shrinking, disappearing, and also they didn't practice written documentation. They usually practiced storytelling through generations. So as people have passed away in those tribes, and as the tribes have shrunk or been largely ignored and not included in American history, we have been lacking that information. And because a lot of that sign language that they've used hasn't been documented, including the deaf people in those communities. We don't have good documentation of that. But now, we have people who identify as Native, who are able to tell stories from long ago. And so now more and more we have linguists and deaf scholars, deaf historians, who are interested in collecting those stories and in hopes of gathering that and documenting it. There's one really good book if you're curious to know more about what deaf Native society looked like or what the stories were like. I recommend this book. It's called Step Into the Circle. The book documents many different stories passed on from different generations of Native people. Many of them start with my grandparents or may include famous Native tales, and that's written there. This book is really just one of a few good books that focus on Native American stories and deaf stories in Native communities. So if you're curious about that, you should definitely check out this book. So now we're going to talk about gestures and home signs. So it's highly documented that as soon as children are bored, they're looking for a language, whether it's through hearing or seeing. When babies aren't even 1 year old, even just a few months old, they're already craving for that language, looking for a communication system of any kind. It's just an automatic part of our brain. As soon as we're born, we're looking for a language and a way to communicate. If it's through the ear, people often listen for hearing patterns to try to figure out and break down language in order to understand language systems. If it's a deaf person, they'll be looking for those same patterns through visual means and sign language. Doesn't matter if a child is hearing or deaf, if there's no language system at all in place, at all, if they don't even have a language system, as they grow, they will themselves develop their own communication system, and oftentimes that is a gestural system. Research shows that babies use gesture by pointing very often. So if they see something they want, they'll point at it. If they see something they don't like or don't want, they'll point at it. Pointing is highly used, and that kind of pointing leads to gestures. Sometimes those kids, and most of the times kids, will copy behaviors of adults. So when adults are drinking, like sipping from a cup, which is the actual sign for drink, like this, drink, parents might sign that, and then the babies will sign it or see that parents are doing it and then sign it to express their wants and needs. So as soon as parents start using the same gestures, that back and forth of gesture between parents and children, we call that home sign. So for example, my father grew up going to a deaf residential school about 8 hours away from home. So he would stay there for months on end, and he would only come back home for vacations, maybe during the summer. So because he stayed at home and his parents were at home with my dad's brothers and sisters, they were all hearing and none of them knew sign language at all. There was no internet access, no TV, no printed literature about sign language. They had no access to sign language. So when my father would return home, he would end up teaching them some signs because that communication was so important. Over time, they would develop enough understanding to link signs and gestures. And so they would start creating their own gestures for certain things. One good example from my dad's family was the sign for butter. The sign for that is this, butter. This means butter. My grandma would tend to sign butter like this. But that gesture actually looks a lot like the sign for paint. But that's how my grandma would sign it. You know, now they've passed away, but oftentimes they even knew the correct sign for it, but they would stick with their gesture because they had just been gesturing it that way for so long. So, you know, they could say, "Oh, I want butter, please," and they would understand. But, you know, old habits die hard, and they would stick with their gestures. So, you know, the reason why it was this way was because after my grandma was done cooking, whatever was left in the pan, she would take a brush and dip in there. Maybe it would be butter or oil, and she would spread that on the bread or on the vegetables or whatever the case was. And so she would be using that brush, and that's how they ended up coming up with this sign for butter, was to represent that brush painting butter onto the food. So you see how gestures and home signs are highly linked.